The rain had just begun to fall when Samuel Hart stepped into the factory, the metallic scent of steel mixing with the damp air clinging to his coat. Outside, the world was plunged into war, nations clashing, cities burning, and soldiers fighting battles that stretched from deserts to frozen fields. But inside the vast assembly halls of the Harrisburg Ordnance Works, there was another front line, just as critical, just as desperate. Here, the clang of hammers and the hiss of torches formed a symphony of urgency. Every rivet, bolt, and weld mattered. Every mistake meant a risk to the men standing miles away in trenches, tank turrets, or artillery outposts. Samuel wiped his boots on the mat and nodded to the guard at the door. Everyone in the plant knew him. Most of them looked at him with a mix of respect and curiosity. He wasn't loud. He wasn't a leader who gave speeches. But he had a steadiness, a solidness, that made people pause. Some said he could weld with his eyes closed. Others whispered that he never made a mistake. But none of them knew the truth that hung like a weight inside him. Each weld he laid down felt like a promise. A promise that the men depending on his work would have a fighting chance. The factory floor stretched out in rows of steel frames and tank hulls under construction. Sparks rained like fiery waterfalls as workers hunched over torches. Samuel walked toward Station 12, where his assigned hull waited, a massive steel beast with edges that looked jagged, incomplete, hungry for the welds that would bind it into a fortress. "Morning, Sam," called out Big Joe, a burly riveter with arms thick as the pipes he hammered. "Rain slowed you down." "Rain slows everyone," Samuel replied with a small smile. His voice was low and even, always calm, even when the outside world wasn't. Big Joe shook his head. "Not you. Seems like nothing shakes you." Samuel didn't respond to that. Instead, he picked up his helmet, lowered it over his head, and examined the seam he would be working on today, the armor join between the upper glacis plate and the side armor. It was a notorious weak point. Most welders cursed at it. Some rushed through it. Others left tiny imperfections, barely visible, but enough to make the difference between a tank surviving a shell hit or bursting into flames. Samuel knew because he had seen it. His younger brother's tank had been hit in North Africa. A report later revealed a weld had failed, letting shrapnel slice into the crew compartment. His brother had been one of 3 lost that day. Since then, Samuel's hands had never shaken, but his heart had carried a scar deeper than any gouge in steel. He clicked on his torch and the world narrowed to a bright blue line. Heat surged against his gloves, sparks leapt, and the steel glowed like a miniature sunrise. To anyone else, welding was just joining metal. But to Samuel, each bead of molten steel was a stitch in the armor of a soldier he would never meet. His welds became the hidden shield that stood between life and death. Hours passed, the fiery line moving with a precision that was almost artistic. Samuel didn't rush. He didn't pause. He moved at exactly the pace that ensured strength, depth, and perfect penetration. Around him, the factory roared. But inside his helmet, there was only the hiss of flame and steel surrendering to heat. By noon, his back ached, and sweat dripped down his neck. He lifted his visor and inspected the weld. It was smooth, clean, and flawless. Not a ripple out of place. When he stepped back, he noticed a young man watching him. Probably no older than 19. Lean, nervous, with a patch on his uniform indicating he was a new hire. "Your Hart, right?" the boy asked. Samuel nodded. "Who's asking?" "Miller. George Miller. They've assigned me to work under you for training." Samuel sighed inwardly. He didn't like taking apprentices. Too much talking. Too many questions. But the war needed welders, and the factory couldn't afford to lose time on slow training. "Fine," Samuel said. "Grab a helmet. You're with me." Miller hurried off to get his gear, practically tripping over his own feet. Samuel shook his head. This boy, he looked soft. Nervous. Not the type that could stand for hours under heat and sparks. But war didn't care about types. It pulled everyone in. As the afternoon shift began, Samuel showed Miller how to align the plates, how to clean the metal before welding, how to angle the torch just right. Miller watched, trying to copy him, but his hand trembled, and the weld puddle crawled unevenly. "No," Samuel said firmly. "Your hand's talking too much." "My hand. It's telling me you're scared. Metal can smell fear." Miller blinked, unsure whether he was serious. Samuel took the torch from him gently. Look, welding isn't about speed, it's about respect. Respect the heat, respect the steel, respect the life that will sit behind it. He demonstrated again. Smooth, controlled, unwavering. Miller tried a second time. Still shaky, but better. War created welders fast. Samuel hoped this one would last long enough to learn. Just before the end of the shift, the factory foreman, Mr. Harlan, approached with a clipboard. "Hart," he barked, "we need you in the testing bay. Something urgent." Samuel followed him across the floor, weaving through machines until they reached a secure room. Inside were 3 military officers and a tank hull, damaged, blackened, and bearing the scars of battle. It had been shipped back from the front lines. Harlan lowered his voice. "This one took a direct hit in Italy. The crew survived. The armor held where it shouldn't have." An officer pointed to a charred weld line on the hull. "This weld saved them," he said. "We traced the marks. It's yours." Samuel stared at the scorched steel, his name stamped near the seam. A wave of emotions hit him. Not pride, not triumph, but something deeper. Relief. Validation. Proof that his brother's death wasn't in vain, that his work mattered. The officer continued, "We want you to travel to the new facility in Maryland. Train an entire team. Your welding technique, it needs to be taught." Samuel shook his head. "I'm not a teacher. You are now," the officer said simply. That night, after returning home, Samuel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter of assignment. His small house was quiet, filled only with the faint ticking of the clock. He had kept his life simple. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. It was easier that way. No room for distractions, no room for loss. But training others meant responsibility. And responsibility meant risking failure. What if they couldn't learn? What if they couldn't replicate his welds? What if a bad weld cost another life, one he could have prevented? He closed his eyes and pictured his brother's smile. Then he pictured the faces of the crew from the damaged tank, unknown men who had climbed out of smoke and fire because one weld had held firm. His jaw tightened. He would go. The Maryland facility was larger, newer, and far more chaotic. Hundreds of workers moved through it like ants in a hive. And now Samuel found himself standing in front of 20 trainees, men and women of all ages, shapes, and backgrounds. He hated it, not them, but the talking, the explaining, the pressure. Yet every day, he showed them what mattered. How to hold the torch steady. How to clean the steel. How to feel the temperature change. How to know when the weld was too shallow or too wide. How to listen to the hiss of molten metal as if it were whispering a secret. Miller was transferred to the Maryland plant as well. Samuel didn't ask why, but he suspected the foreman wanted him to continue learning. The boy improved, slowly, then quickly. Samuel even caught himself nodding with approval more than once. One evening, after the shifts ended, Miller approached him. "Mr. Hart, is it true your weld saved a tank crew?" Samuel didn't answer at first. Finally, he said, "Steel does the saving. I just help it along." Miller hesitated. "My brother's in the infantry. If he ever rides in a tank, I just hope it's one of the ones you worked on." Samuel felt a familiar ache in his chest. He didn't reply, but his voice was quieter when he said, "Then let's make sure every weld counts." Months passed. The trainees grew more skilled. Production soared. Inspectors reported fewer weld failures. More tanks returned from the front with stories of narrow escapes thanks to reinforced seams. And while Samuel never took credit, word spread among the soldiers. Some tanks had hard welds, and those were the ones you wanted to be inside when hell broke loose. Then came the day that tested everything. A shipment of freshly welded hulls was undergoing ballistic testing on site. Each hull was placed behind heavy barriers and fired upon to ensure weld strength. Samuel oversaw the tests quietly from a distance as shells slammed into steel, sending tremors through the floor. When the final hull was fired upon, the impact caused a loud, unnatural crack. Inspectors rushed forward. The weld had failed. Samuel approached slowly. His trainees gathered behind him nervously. Miller stood closest. "It wasn't one of ours," Miller said quickly. "The stamp? Look, it's from the night crew." Samuel crouched, examining the break. The failure wasn't due to improper materials. It wasn't due to a structural fault. It was rushed work. A bad weld. A dangerous weld. Harlan strode in, furious. Hart, you're responsible for quality here. Samuel rose calmly. Then let me fix it. He ordered the entire day crew to gather. Even the night shift workers arrived, drawn by the tension. Samuel took off his helmet and held it at his side. You want these welds to pass inspection. You want them to survive the battlefield. His voice was strong, carrying through the hall. Then you need to understand something. These aren't just lines of melted steel. They are armor, barriers, shields. Someone's son, brother, or father will be sitting behind this spot right here. He tapped the broken seam. This weld failed today, but out there, it won't be a test shell. It'll be a real one. And someone won't get a second chance. The room was silent. No shortcuts, he said. Ever. Over the following weeks, standards sharpened. Bad welds became rare. Trainees reached excellence. The Hart method, as it was unofficially called, became the plant's new standard. As winter settled in and the war pushed toward its brutal final chapters, Samuel continued training welders, all while still laying down his own flawless seams. Every tank that left the plant was stronger. Every weld was dependable. Every worker carried a piece of his discipline. Then one cold February morning, as snow dusted the fields outside the factory, a letter arrived addressed to Samuel. It was from the crew whose tank had been saved by his weld months ago. They had written to thank him. One wrote, "Your weld held when the enemy fire tried to tear us apart. Because of you, we're alive. You'll never know us, but we know you. Your work is our shield." Samuel sat down slowly, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. He read it over and over. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly breathe. As the war ended and the factory shifted to peacetime production, Samuel trained the last batch of welders and prepared to return to a quieter life. But his legacy remained in every machine built, every trainee who had learned his craft, every soldier who came home because a welded seam didn't break. He became a legend, though he never asked for recognition. Most heroes never do. His welds carried a piece of him, steady, unwavering, protective. Years later, long after the war had faded into textbooks and memories, historians would study the tanks that survived battles against all odds. Engineers would examine the unusual weld patterns, stronger, deeper, more resilient. They'd note how these welds often appeared on machines that had taken the heaviest fire yet remained operational. Some would call it skill. Some would call it luck. But those who knew the truth understood it differently. It was Samuel Hart, the quiet man with steady hands and a wounded heart. The welder who poured his soul into every molten bead. The craftsman whose silent work became a shield for men he'd never meet. And long after the factories stopped ringing with the sound of war, long after Samuel laid down his torch for the final time, his welds remained, hidden lines of strength in forgotten machines, silent guardians forged in fire. The hidden shield that defied enemy fire.